Hello, and welcome to Life is a Scale Model. If you haven't already subscribed to our channel, I would ask that you would please hit that subscribe button to help us get to 100 subscribers before we hit the end of the year. And also like the video, it helps us in the algorithm. So I feel as though I need to provide you guys with a little explanation as to why we're so late getting this video out, because it's been a little over a month since the last video was uploaded. That primarily comes down to some chronic health issues that I deal with, and sometimes it just makes it a little bit difficult to work as quickly as I would like. Also, this time of year tends to be when I'm at the hospital doing doctor's visits the most. The number one reason, though, as we'll get into later in the video, is that I just got way out in the weeds with this particular build. And so we're going to cover some of the things that I did that didn't work out so well, and I'm going to inform you as to ways that I have found that might help you avoid some of my mistakes. But I do try to keep as regular a schedule as I can for you guys so that you can get great model building content all throughout the year. So we're at the decal part of building this Enterprise B kit, and this is kind of where I already started getting off in the weeds. Right now I'm doing one of the easier decals for this kit, the little ridgeback area that goes on the top of the drive section of the ship. It's flat. There were a couple areas where I needed to cut in order to make it fit around some of the contour of the ship itself, but by and large it's pretty straightforward. Where I got out in the weeds, you can see we're still doing sub-assemblies, and I am not terribly experienced with sub-assemblies. In fact, this is the first build where I've tried in earnest to use that particular method of build. So it was quite a steep learning curve for me. And if you're used to just building a model all the way up and then doing your base coat and your paint and then your decals, then I imagine that this is going to be a change that requires quite a steep learning curve for you as well. I again, am not terribly experienced, and so there were things that I didn't think of ahead of time as I was going into this project. One of which is how when you cake paint and lacquer onto parts that are meant to snap the kit together, it changes the fitment. And so I did find myself later on in the build fighting quite a bit with the fitment of the pieces, simply because they had, a few millimeters of probably not a few, but like maybe a millimeter of extra goop on them. So that is something to consider as you're getting ready to maybe spray or lacquer or whatever. Maybe make sure that you've taped off your joint areas, like your pegs and stuff, so that you don't get paint and lacquer and whatnot caked on them and change the fitment. That's me admitting that I did some things maybe not in the most effective way. That's one of the issues I found. But also, this kit is about to be 30 years old. And while they did make a change, which surprised me, they made a slight change to the bottom of the drive section to make it fit on one of the smaller globe stands that they give you with the kit. This model has remained pretty much unchanged for the last 30 years. I'm not entirely keen on how the lifespan of a model mold is calculated or how it progresses, but I ran into some pretty terrible issues with this kit where fitment is involved, and I don't think that it was exclusively my misunderstandings of building subassemblies that contributed to that. The pod area that the warp nacelle pylons attaches to there you can see the little oval spot where that's supposed to sit and snap in place, was actually warped and bowed upwards away from the hull. So when I got to the final assembly of things, I ended up having to cut the legs off of it, and then I placed a couple of pieces of styrene to fill the gaps where the snapping peg should go, and I had to glue it on just onto the surface. After I, took the piece and sanded it with one of my files to actually make it flat, because it was a pretty significant bow in the center. Another area where I was surprised I'd run into issues was with the fit between the neck and the saucer. And I haven't quite figured out exactly what contributed to that, but I feel like at some point the saucer having a recessed area in the shape of the neck was intended to sit with that recessed area flat against the neck itself. But as I tried to put it together, what I realized was that that recessed area was entirely too small for the neck to fit. And you can see that recessed area right there. It looks at first glance like it might be about the same size, but again, and this might come back to how I did the sub-assemblies, I found it was just way too small to fit the neck in there. I couldn't get the snap pegs to engage at all, so I ended up cutting those off and doing my best to get a good straight fit. It didn't work out. You'll see in the end. So now that we're kind of all out of order, I decided to throw some footage in here of me doing some of the saucer decals. To be perfectly honest, as far as decals are concerned, this kit's not too bad. I think when they did some of the saucer decals, especially at the top, where you got the Aztecing for the top of the saucer, they may have actually incorporated the excess decal they would need to fit over the raised grid lines. And so when I sanded it all flat and then put the decals on, there was a teeny tiny bit of overlap on either side of the center decal. That's not a hard one to overcome if you just, lay the decal over the model before you put it in the water or whatever you use to, debond the decal from its backing paper, and then take a quick look at if there's any overlap. You could probably trim that pretty easily. But I found that interesting that they actually took that into consideration, possibly when they measured the size of the decals for print. Right now I'm doing this little sensor pod thing. It's very fiddly and it wanted to stick to my finger really, really badly. And it didn't go on quite as nicely as I had hoped, but it didn't take a whole lot of coaxing to get into place. I will say I broke, I think, 2, maybe 3, or I should say I tore 2 or 3 decals with this one. Probably it would have been less had I not been handling the model before I put the gloss coat on, but after I'd gotten most of the decals on, because my thumb pulled one of the decals off of the warp nacelles after I'd put it in place, and that's when it tore. So all in all, I'd say that these decals are actually pretty good by round 2 standards. And as long as you pay attention to where they're supposed to be and go slow and really think about what you're doing with them, they're really not that bad to put on. I feel like I mostly put this footage in just, to as kind of a routine thing. Really the most interesting and difficult, and I think the part that needs to be focused on the most with this kit, are the warp nacelles. The warp nacelle decals come in pairs, so there are 4 of them that are designed to just kind of wrap around the whole entire nacelle. And when I did nacelles on my previous build of this one, the decals were not very easy to get into place the way that they were intended to via the instructions. And so at that point, I just kind of made a mental note of how I might improve the experience and improve getting the decals onto the model itself. And so that really ended up being the focus of this video. But I think I probably got somewhere in the realm of like 10 hours of footage for this video, because, well, things are just bigger, and as things get bigger, they naturally take more time. And so I had a lot of footage of me putting decals on, and I didn't want to bore you guys with too much of that, so I'm doing a highlight reel, as it were. Now this bottom decal for the Enterprise B, is the bottom saucer decal, is just, it's just really easy. It's not super terrible. It's a relatively flat surface. That really makes it that really makes the difference in how difficult it is to put the decal on. So you shouldn't find yourself struggling too much with this particular one. Putting down my microsol so that the decal gets proper adhesion to the model itself. I don't remember when in the process I started this, but at some point I got a wider square brush that would spread more material more quickly. I just got kind of bored of using my regular decal brush and wanted to speed up the process a little bit. So if you have large areas like that and you've got a spare square tip brush that you can use to put down your decal liquids and whatnot, then I can tell you from personal experience now that isn't such a bad idea. Go for the Gusto. Highly recommend. As you can see, this one just kind of slid into place for the most part. I had to do a little adjustment. I'll also say this is not really the highlight of this area. We'll get to that in just a moment. But when I build these models, it's kind of become a tradition to start on the bottom of the saucer for some reason. So I figured, why break from tradition, right? But you can see me just gently using my finger. I do like to use the tips of my forceps there to move things around, simply because I get probably unnecessarily aggressive when it comes to placing decals. But I found with a microsol, especially if you don't put enough, it really starts to bond that decal to that surface pretty quick. So that's why I ended up at the square tip brush, because I realized, oh, that's why my decals are like sticking to the model almost immediately. So now I should be able to continue doing my craft with, slightly less aggression towards the decals. That said, that system works pretty well for me, and if you find a system that works for you, I highly recommend that you stick to it, because we all do things different, and with rare exceptions, I don't think there's really a right or wrong necessarily. I think you could probably measure things out in a good, better, best kind of way, but people just kind of find what works for them and do it. Here I am fixing a goof, because you can see I yanked on that decal a little too hard and it wrinkled on me. So I'm just trying to get things as flattened out as I can for now. I did go back after the fact with microset and after the decal had set and everything was dry, I cut through a few of the bubbles and put some micro set down to flatten that out a bit further, and I think the results were pretty good. These round decals are just a little bit more difficult than some of the others. They like to shift all the way around the 360-degree arc of the decal. So you might find yourself trying to get bubbles out and it's just racing around the ring, as it were. If that's a place you find yourself in, my recommendation would be just leave it alone, let it dry and sit. And then once it's all dry, take a really sharp hobby knife, maybe with a brand new razor blade, and poke a little hole or make a little slash through it, and then put some micro set on it. And that micro set will get under the decal, and it'll pull the decal down onto the surface of the model a bit better and shrink everything up a bit to make it conform to the surface of the model. I probably spent way more time than is practical or necessary doing this, but that recommendation will save you oodles of time in the grand scheme of things. Just a lot of wavy deformations there, and my ADHD brain just wants to chase them all down and make them all go away. Future me would tell past me in that situation, just let it go for a minute, buddy. There I am, finally calling it good. So now we're going to get to, I think, the most interesting part of this particular area of decaling, and that's these little teal trench decals. I call them the trench decals because there's that trench ring that goes around the bottom of the saucer. When I built this the last time, I was not experienced enough to adequately measure, quote unquote, the decal fit of the decals I was putting down. And so there ended up being a little bit of overlap between these two decals. And although I can't wholeheartedly endorse subassembly building this particular model, this is one area where I found that building in subassemblies was extremely helpful, because what I was able to do, as you will see, is I was able to place these decals and then position them, and I had a little extra wiggle room because I didn't have them bunching up against the neck of the ship at that point. And so I could leave the overhang there where the saucer and the neck of the ship join, and then I was able to just go cut that excess off later on after I had put some gloss coat over top of that. So that was nice. I don't think nice enough to justify doing this particular kit in subassemblies, but I also want to stay away from that topic for now until we get to our post-mortem notes. But you can see I tried to cut things real close to the decal, just a little bit of excess paper, because I remembered from my last build, if I keep these things trimmed real tight, then I can measure them better. That was me trying to decide how I was going to cut the last little bit of that. Sometimes I just like to trim everything away before I trim it down close to the decal. And I was trying to figure out, well, if I do that, what am I going to do with these other tiny decals? And I wanted to keep them attached to the paper. I thought that might be a good idea, so I didn't lose any decals during my build process. one potential frustration of model building is getting to the decaling part and then realizing that your decal, you've lost a decal and it's missing. And that's no fun. So I try to avoid that when I do my builds. There I am, fixated on them bubbles again. Just can't get me away. Past me, you need to get over them bubbles, dude. Honestly, it speaks to the nature of the hobby. Why am I obsessively trying to iron out bubbles on this decal that I just placed? Well, because the inescapable fact of the matter is that you have to wait for the decal to debond from the backing paper, and you can't rush that process. Some decals go through that process, it takes like 15 seconds. Others, like some of the round 2 decals I've worked with in the past, can take upwards of a minute. And I don't know. I just do random things while I'm waiting for decals to work off their backing paper. Sometimes I surf Facebook on my phone. Other times I obsessively try to work out bubbles under decals that I just placed. It just depends on what I have going on at the time and what kind of mood I'm in. Because sometimes I'm actually doing stuff that pertains to the channel. Like recently I've been gathering all of the supplies that will be necessary for our next build, which is, in my opinion, going to be super exciting. As a little preview, we are going to explore the wonderful wide world of airbrushing. That's all I'm going to say. So you can see I'm struggle bussing. We've got this decal already peeled off the backing paper. It's dangling. I'm trying to keep it under control, and it looks worse than it is. I promise. Everything goes relatively smooth once I get the decal in contact with the model. You might find yourself having experiences like this at times where it's like, oh no, I'm totally gonna ruin this decal placement because I can't keep the thing under control. Don't worry. Don't panic. Just take a breath and just work through things slow and steady. And I promise everything will more than likely turn out fine. So now we got that decal in the trench. And now I'm going to use the tips of my forceps there. You see I have them closed. That's to make them not quite so sharp and pointy against that decal. I'm just going to use the tips of my forceps there to kind of work it flat whilst trying to keep it centered so that when I place the next decal, they can meet in the middle without overlapping. And I will say that's the one thing about building this in a sub-assembly fashion that I really was happy with. In fact, I'm really happy with how these decals went on in general, like just all over the model, and I like the way they look. When we get to the postmortem, I'll explain that further, but let me just say, in a vacuum, without having already done this before, if this was my first time building this kit, I would have to admit that once you get it base coated and you start getting those decals on, it looks really, really slick. I just marveled the whole time. I was like, wow, this is so pretty looking. I'm a little biased. The Enterprise B is probably my favorite iteration of the Enterprise. but these decals, which came out of the 2017, I call it the Lineage set that came with, the Enterprises from the NX01 all the way through the E. They did some color correction on them, which I really appreciated, I think. I'm not sure yet, because I'm definitely going to do this build again, only with decals that end up looking a different color. And at that point, I'll be able to really say whether or not I like these decals over the others. But at the moment, I have to say that these decals just pop really well against the white of the model, once you've got that model base coated white. And they give it this really cool just very cool effect. Not like cool like, hey, that's cool, man, but actually color temperature cool. And I really enjoyed that. The other advantage of these particular decals, which are the same decals, by the way, as you would get in the Enterprise set that just came out in August, that has the NX01 and the TOS Enterprise and the refit and the B. When I showed the paints for the detail painting back in the previous episode, I had Vallejo model color aquamarine, and it is pretty much a spot-on match to the color that they use for these decals here. So I took advantage of that fact, and when I did the nacelles, I painted the bottom fins that come off the bottom of the warp nacelles aquamarine to match what I had in my Haynes book. And I am not quite certain how I like that yet. I'm going to have to give that one a closer look, because it's the first time I tried that, and I'm not sure how accurate it is. But it was in the book, so that's what I did. That was my resource for finding out what the ship would look like, and so I stuck to it. Yeah, there's a little more blue in these decals than in the decals I've seen on previous sets. The previous sets are a little bit warmer, they're a little bit more green. And that's fine too. But I just hadn't experienced that before with this particular ship. And kudos to whoever at round 2 decided to do it that way, because yeah, it looks really good. I'm taking my time here. You might be feeling like I'm taking so much time. If you're here for the first time, or just for first, second, third time, you're not familiar with the hobby of scale modeling, all I can say is this is the reality of it. It takes a lot of time. It's not the destination that's important, though. It's the journey. But you can see that lays down real well in that little trench. And because I didn't have the neck to deal with, I was able to get it placed really, really well. And I wanted to take advantage of that fact. I mean, I was trying to make this thing look as amazing as my skills would allow. And I feel like that's one reason why maybe I got off in the weeds a little bit much. I was trying so hard to make this build look amazing that I tripped over my own feet a little bit. But that's all right. We'll talk about what I learned and what we can take away from it. And I'm not going to fret, because I'll take what I learned and I'll just try it again. And I imagine, the next go round, after learning even more about how to tame this kit and make it look amazing, I will end up with an even better looking product. So I'm just real carefully cutting out this decal here. If you've got a really sharp hobby knife, you don't have to put a lot of pressure to cut these decals out. I know it looks like I'm putting a lot of pressure, and that's because I'm moving, in an arc. But when you've got a sharp enough hobby knife, you just need a little pressure to break through that backing paper. Now you might wonder why I set my model pieces when I'm putting decals and whatnot on these paper towels. And the answer to that question is, well, one, good question, but two, you can see my little cutting mat there is quite a colorful character, and I don't want that hard abrasive discolored surface rubbing the finish off my models. So I put a little paper towel down, and that cushions the model while it's sitting on the bench and minimizes the paint and whatnot getting rubbed off. Also, as you can see in the top corner of that paper towel, I also use it to dry my brushes while I'm working. Keeps them right where I need them. So that's the point of that. I don't know that I could ever replace my little blue cutting mat. I got that thing, oh golly, almost 20 years ago when I first got into the hobby, and it's been like a cutting mat to me. We've had some good times, me and that cutting mat. So now you're going to see, like, really see what I'm talking about when it comes to these trench decals. Because we're going to put that second decal on, and we're gonna line them up real good. So there she is. Just going to take my forceps there and slide that decal off just a little bit to, kind of break the adhesion between the decal and the backing paper. You can see already this one's going a little bit more smoothly than the last one, and that's how things tend to go for me. I do things kind of precariously the first time around, but once I've done it, I get a little bit more confidence and I'm able to do things a little bit better. Still not a perfect placement there, but we're almost there. I got to be extra careful with this part that landed on the decal, the Aztecing decal, because I don't want to pull that Aztecing decal out of place while I'm trying to maneuver this one. So then I'll have to fix the Aztec decal as well. And we all know the last thing I need in my life at this moment is a reason to play with that decal again. Just very carefully pulling it back into that trench, getting it straightened out. And would you look at that? Sticks the landing. Well, almost. But as you can see, I don't have any overlap. There's a little gap there, and I'll fix that in a minute, but that really goes together. That goes together really well. So I'll just work my way around that little trench, and I figure since I still have a little gap of white between the two decals that I would work this one up towards the other decal and I'm just trying to iron out those bubbles and wavy ridges and stuff in order to get those two decals to meet up at the middle. Just like that. Working with my decal brush. Another good tool that I've added recently to my arsenal of decal placement tools is the pre-moistened Q-tip. I have used dried Q-tips before and didn't like it because, they're dry, they can absorb water, and some of you are thinking, well, duh. But it irked me that it would absorb my water while I was trying to place the decal. And then I was watching somebody else, and they're like, yeah, you should totally dip your Q-tip in water and pre-moisten it so that it can't suck up the water while you're moving your decals around on your model. I'm like, what? Yeah, it was a mind explosion point for me. Forgive me, for I am a little slow. Okay, so now we've moved to the top of the saucer, and you can see we're way further along in the build process than we were just before. And I'm having a good time placing the final registry piece. This is supposed to be like my victory lap. And I'm about to get up, and something in my brain is going to be like, wait, no, that doesn't look quite right to me. And I'm sure eagle-eyed viewers at this point are like, that looks terrible. That's not what it's supposed to look like. You're right. We'll get back to that. Now, here's what I did for the decals, for the nacelles. You can see those 4 pieces I cut them into. They come all as one big piece that you are expected to carefully maneuver around the entirety of the nacelle. And if you're Bill Krause or you're Mark Myers or somebody who has decades of experience building these things, you maybe could make that work. But we're a beginner channel around here. Maybe sometimes we stray into the intermediate area of things, but mostly we're for beginners. And I found that trying to work with those decals in one giant piece was just untenable. So you can see the 4 pieces I cut them into. I cut the chiller grills, the black chiller grills, into their own piece. There's an Aztecing piece that runs the length of the nacelle that I cut into its own piece. There's the green and blue whatevers that I forgot the name of that go on the top of the nacelle. So I cut that into its own piece, and then there's a little teeny tiny sliver of Aztecing that goes on the backs of the back end of the nacelle, and I cut that into its own piece. And what I found was that it made the decal placement process a whole lot easier. And I know from having built the NX01 refit that somebody at round 2 knows that we beginners can handle, teeny tiny delicate fiddly little decals. So if you're listening, round 2, my little solution to things was pretty great, and it made the entire process of putting those decals on those warp nacelles a whole lot easier. Love this shot, by the way, because you can see the aquamarine that I put on those nacelle fins. Again, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that, because it's been a minute since I watched Star Trek Generations. I'm not sure how accurate that is. But like I said, that's what it looked like in my Haynes manual, so that's what I went with. So I'm redoing the decals that go on the bottom of the warp nacelle pylons. I do believe I mentioned those in the previous video, and they were all taped up and stuff. This is actually, these are donor parts from another version of the kit that I have, or a copy of the kit. And I suppose now is as good a time as any to start talking about how I ended up out in the weeds, because the culprit for my misery is sitting right in front of us, and that's the warp engine assembly of the USS Enterprise NCC 1701B. And here's the story, and it's all true, I promise. So, in my pursuit of, quote, accuracy, one thing I noticed about this kit is that when you put the warp nacelles on, there's a phenomenon that occurs that I haven't quite figured out. Now, if you look at the instructions, the way you put the nacelles on is pretty straightforward. They come in two halves. There's pegs on the outsides of the warp pylons that the outer parts of the warp nacelles connect to, and that holds them in place. And then there are pegs along the length of the nacelles themselves that you use to connect the warp nacelles together and hold them in place. So the way I would start dry fitting is I would connect the outer warp nacelle pieces to the pylons. And what I found is they would sit nice and straight, upright, fully vertical, the way they're supposed to. Perfect alignment. Love it. But what would happen when I put the inner nacelle pieces on and started pushing things together to see how they would fit, the inner nacelle portions would actually cause the nacelles to twist. So they were sticking out at basically the same angle as the pylons themselves, which is, I think, roughly maybe like a 7 or 10% angle. It's not huge, but if you've seen pictures of the Enterprise B, you know that the nacelle pylons come out at a slight angle, and then the nacelles themselves sit straight vertical in relation to the rest of the ship. And that is the effect that I was trying to achieve. And so in my pursuit of doing so, I essentially destroyed my warp nacelle pieces and my poor little pylon. I do have footage of that. Maybe I'll throw that up for like a Casey's Greatest Fail or something video. If y'all want to see a Casey's Greatest Fail compilation video at some point, get down in the comments and let me know. I'd be happy to post it. But yeah, I was trying everything from like adding styrene shims to just about anything you could think of right now. What I ended up doing with this particular set of pieces is, after I got the nacelles placed, then I used my heat gun to soften things up, and I tried to like finagle them to be straight at that point. That was not the best solution, I think, either. Like, it didn't destroy the entire model the way that my previous solution did, but it sure didn't help things in the way that I envisioned them when I had set out to do that particular action. What it ended up doing is it ended up deforming the joint between the warp nacelles and the actual pylons, and you can't really see it unless you look real close. But I know it's there, and it's going to irk me for time and all eternity because, you know, now I've got weird bulges in my nacelles. To more experienced modelers who may or may not have built this kit, if you've got some solutions that you've used that have been successful in aligning these nacelles properly, why don't you throw those down in the comments as well for those of us who haven't quite gotten there yet. Um, let's see, I tried my heat gun just trying to warm the tips where the nacelles um, slot onto the pylons, and unfortunately the round 2 builds some detail into that area of the model that is extremely small and delicate, and I ended up melting those, and I cut them off, and I used filler to try to hide that little mistake. Um, but yeah, I don't know why it is that when you clip those two, when you finally press those two warp nacelle halves together, they go out of alignment so drastically and terribly. But I'm holding that against round 2 because that seems like a huge deficit in the design of how the nacelles go together in the first place. I'm not taking any responsibility for the poor fitment of that. Also, for some reason, the nacelles are a bit bowed, and they don't seam it until you get them put together. So I don't know what happened there, if that was my heat gun that did that. I don't think it was, but it could have been. So I'll throw that out as possibly being my fault, but I just thought it was weird that they appear bowed, even if they're not. Now you can see here, this footage was shot before I started chopping up decals, but you can see all of the little parts that I cut into their own little decal pieces. And like I said, this ended up working incredibly well. One thing I did for the starboard nacelle that I didn't do for the port nacelle, but I really liked, you can see that little tab on the bluish green part of the nacelle decal that rises up from the rest of it. It overlaps at the front of the nacelle, and I don't know why it's there, but I ended up cutting that off for the starboard nacelle because I just didn't like the way it overlapped, and it looked really good. I think this might be the almighty footage where I actually cut one of these up for you guys to show you how I cut them. And it's been a month, and some of this footage was shot quite a while ago. But yeah, it's definitely a lot of work. You know, it's a lot of delicate work. But I think that the results justify the effort. Because I remember, 11 or 12 years ago, building this for the first time and trying desperately to get those decals to lay down properly and just wrap them around every curve and angle of the ship, and it was just so difficult. So there's nothing wrong with cutting decals down to smaller sub decals. Sometimes it just makes life easy. We're gonna have a serious chat here at the Life as a Scale model offices about how my editor edits. I apologize. This is a long sequence of me doing absolutely nothing. But it is a good opportunity to say, hey, look at all the decals, and we're going to cut them down. And I'm even pointing, like, I'm gonna do all this. And we sure are too. Like, I don't know, I'm gonna harp on it because it's probably the best idea I had during this entire build, and it just worked out so well. And when you stumble onto a good thing, you just gotta share it with the world, and I just gotta share it with the world. This was like a revelation for me. It's like, wow, it doesn't have to seem impossible to put these decals on properly. We can put them on, and it doesn't have to be hard. I seriously think at this point I was trying to figure out which decal goes on which part of which nacelle. I think that was the reason for the awkward, lengthy pause there. Is I was trying to figure out, okay, I don't want to get these decals mixed up. It is entirely possible to get these decals mixed up and put them on backwards. And I definitely didn't want to be doing that as the person who's, trying to teach you how to make these models look really great. So that's probably why there was such the awkward pause. Is I was looking at my Haynes manual and I was looking at the instructions and I was trying to be like super for sure, like, okay, this decal goes here. Because if you mix it up, you're going to end up with backwards decals and it's not going to look so good. Oh man, we're so close to a hair fail right now. So close. Okay, I'm going to call it as a hair fail. I put the 1 day without hair fail incident thing at the end. We're gonna retract that. I retract that statement. That's kind of a hair fail. You can see I'm just real carefully cutting along the black warp chiller grill there. I did invest. My wife and I went to Walmart last week, and she ended up dragging me to the clearance section, and they had some nice little metal rulers with like the cork back so that they don't slide so easy. And so I invested in one of those, so I don't have to freehand that anymore. And if you're not comfortable freehanding, then by all means get something, a straight edge or something that you can use to create your straight lines when you're doing cuts like that. There's no shame in needing a guide to help you do cuts. I just found myself actually kind of rebuilding my my supply of tools during this build, and certainly there are some tools that I don't have anymore that I wish I did, and I think I'm going to invest in replacing those tools in the next little while. This is where we sit and we wait for the decal to separate from the decal paper. But as you can see, I've switched over to that big square tipped brush to put my microsol on the model surface there. It holds more and it distributes it more evenly, and it just makes the process a little bit quicker, a little easier. So it looks like we're working on the port nacelle, and so you'll get to see how I do these 4 little sub decals. While we're waiting for me to do whatever it is that I'm doing, which is probably checking the decal to see if it's ready to go. One of the tools that I really wish I had at my disposal this build that I didn't is my Dremel. I bought a couple of, well, I can't call them Dremels because of trademark reasons, but over at Harbor Freight I bought a couple of what Harbor Freight calls rotary tools, and they didn't have one with adjustable speeds at the time, so I bought 2, one that was a low RPM one and one that was a high RPM one, and I probably got a good 7 or 8 years of use out of those before they finally kicked the bucket. They were really handy to have around. They're really good for like if you need to sand down a part and you need to take a lot of material at one time. They're really good for that. So I had a Dremel as well. It was a cordless Dremel that I got for Christmas one year, but unfortunately the battery stopped holding a charge, and it wasn't the kind of setup where you could just keep the battery on the Dremel and then plug it in and use it. Like the battery had a separate charger thing that you plugged in the wall, so that ended up having to go in the trash after we made our most recent move as well. So I'm gonna put a corded Dremel on my Christmas wish list this year and see if old Sandy Claus will bring me some new tools for my bench. I think that's the one I missed the most, though. While I was, stuck out in the weeds, the bogs of trying to figure out those nacelles, I was like, man, I could seriously use a Dremel right now. But I just didn't have one. So here you're going to see, like, I'm probably just going to do this with my fingers, but you're going to see just how easily this goes on now that I've cut it down. You can just imagine, like, trying to do this, and then you've got all that extra decal paper for the chiller grills and the blue green light up thingies that go in the center. Like it would just be terrible trying to finagle that. This was just the bee's knees. Getting my brush so I can work out some folding there. Try to work that decal. You can see again, I don't know what it is with round 2, and I don't have a whole lot of experience with any other companies except Battlefront, which makes Flames of War, and Team Yankee or something like that. Their decals are significantly smaller, for sure, because their figures all come in 100 millimeter size. No, 15 millimeter size, which is 1/100. Sorry, but their decals are more like parchment paper, and I don't know if it's just because of the size or what, but I do find them a lot easier to work with. And you can see from like the sheen on this decal, it's kind of like vinyl paper, and it does make it a little bit more difficult to work with it. I'm looking forward, after we finish Project 2500, sometime at the end of next year, I'm looking forward to getting into some different brands of models for you guys, in addition to doing different subjects that aren't necessarily Star Trek or sci-fi related. I've been very purposefully buying models from different companies so that we can talk about how each brand kind of stacks up against each other brand. Who has the good decals. Who's got the best fitment, things like that. That's not to say we're going to be making comparisons and saying one is better than the other all around. Just, how are they different? What's the focus of each company's product when it comes to how they manufacture their products? I'm really looking forward to getting into that, so we can learn more about the wide world of model companies and things. Now you can see I've got myself way off track here. Why are we doing the third hand past me? Yeah, that took me all of like 10 seconds to realize, you know what? That didn't work all that well. I'm not too crazy about that idea. All I did was goof up what I had already done. But sometimes you gotta make a happy accident to learn. Yeah, as you can see, I'm just trying to be real careful except the part where I pulled out the third hand. That was objectively a dumb idea. Yes, use your third hand on decals that you just placed that may not actually be set yet. That's how we break decals and rip them from the surface of our model, and it makes us sad. Why are we doing those kinds of things? But now I've got my micro set, and I'm working my micro set. Actually, I'm trying to work it under the decal to start getting it to shrink a little bit. And probably I'm a little confused because I think this decal to me seemed a little bit longer than it should be. I don't think that was the case. I think I was just tripping a little bit, but it definitely seemed like it was sitting a little too far forward and that it was just a little too long. That might be a byproduct of how I cut it, because my cuts got a lot closer to the actual shape of the decal as I went along. So if you build this one and you decide to go the route of cutting down the warp nacelle decals, cut them very, very close to the actual piece of decal paper that you're trying to cut down. That'll alleviate having problems like I'm having, and it'll get those decals to fit into the little crevices a lot better. And then you won't waste like 5 minutes, it seems like, doing silly things like I did. But now on to step 2. So I started with the Aztec portion that goes along the bottom of the nacelle. I did that consistently with every last one of them. To me, it just made sense to start from the bottom and work your way up, because then you don't have to worry about setting the piece upside down with freshly applied decals that once again could peel off if like they for some reason adhere to your paper towel or whatever surface you're using to work on. And so that's why I started from the bottom, was to mitigate that potential danger to my work. Yeah, that's definitely a hair fail. I'm redacting my 1 day without hair fail incidents. You can see that's just teeny tiny, but I try to cut it as close to the actual decal as I could, because I knew that one was going to have to wedge between a couple of fins, and I didn't want to have a lot of excess decal paper infringing on that process. So now we wait. That's just what we do. I take sips of soda. My ADHD responds real well to caffeine when it comes to focus. But yeah, it's a good time to stretch your legs, go grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or whatever it is that floats your boat, calms your nerves. Things will happen when they need to happen. Don't try to rush the process. But yeah, we sit and we wait, and we wait, and we wait. And that little decal sits in the water, and the adhesive breaks down that holds it to the backing paper so that we can put it on the model. And that's what's going on. And unfortunately, it feels like it takes forever sometimes. I think some of the more experienced modelers might tell you, don't let your decals sit in the water too long, because having some of that adhesive that holds it to the backing paper can be useful when you put it on the actual model. It'll help the decal to better adhere to the model. So we're not going to let it sit for like an hour. We're going to let it sit for, what did I do? About a minute there, maybe. Minute and some change. And then we're just going to put some microsol. And that's going to help it stick even better. And now we're just going to take this teeny tiny little piece that we cut off of the bigger part, and we're going to put it down. It's hopefully going to be real easy. And there we go. Just like that. Now we'll just make sure it's all straight and proper. And then we'll be ready to move on to the next piece. Yeah, I got really frustrated holding the part by the nacelle because the nacelles will flex a little bit. So if you're building and you get to this part, just keep that in mind. The nacelles are not the best place to secure the model, unfortunately. So now we'll move on to the warp chiller grill. That's what I'm going to call it, because that's what I think it is. It's that dark grayish black part there. And we're just going to, again, very carefully cut down the length of that decal piece. And that's going to help us detach it from the rest of the decal. I was really surprised by this decal backing paper, and I realized from the realization that maybe I've done a few too many round 2 kits in quick and rapid succession, but the backing paper on some of the other kits we've done during this series has had a tendency to curl when you put it in the water. And for some reason, even though that's what I was hoping would happen, it didn't happen with this particular set of decals. And it blew my mind. I was well and truly perplexed. I was like, what the heck? Why aren't you curling? Because I don't have a very big decal water container, if that's what you want to call it. I use a little puck of static grass that I'd gotten during my wargame terrain building days. I ran out of the static grass, and the puck was empty, and there wasn't anything else to do with it. And the models I build are usually so small that I don't really need something super huge. But we're very quickly getting to a point where I might need something super huge to put my decals in and separate them from their backing paper. I did run into issues with that during this build. So that is also something I will be looking into in the coming days. But all that is said in order to say that we don't really need to worry too much about cutting these pieces down any further than we already have. I think that there's definitely a tipping point that exists, if you will, of cutting things down for convenience purposes versus overdoing it and making things unnecessarily difficult for yourself. And I think if you tried to cut these nacelle decals down any further than what I've done, you might find yourself on the other side of the line, just kind of, making things more difficult than they need to be. Okay, so I apologize. I was out of order for this one. We're going to do the blue and green thing first. If you know what that blue and green section is called, I don't have my Haynes manual in my recording studio where I'm doing the audio. But if you happen to know what that thing is called, get in the comments and let us all know. We're going to call it the blue and green thing. That's my official name for it for now. The last time I built this, I wrecked those decals so bad, and then what I ended up doing is I ended up cutting that portion of the decals off of the model, and I found paint, fortunately, that matched the colors relatively well, and I just painted them. And it didn't turn out great, but it worked. But it was just the byproduct. Like, just try to imagine starting from the bottom of that nacelle and then wrapping all of that around all of those complex curves and angles. And it's a great idea in theory, but I'm telling you right now, I think they need me working over there at round 2 to be like the kit common sense person and be like, whoa guys, this doesn't make any sense. And those wraparound decals for the warp nacelles don't make any sense. But with them all separate like that, that is a relatively easy decal place. I was quite pleased with how easily that went on. You can see I just put some microset on my brush there, and I ran it over it real gently, and then I was done. Just a couple of seconds of placement. It really wasn't too bad. I was curious as to how difficult it was going to be to get the warp chiller grills decals placed. I did learn during the process that it makes life a little easier if you trim about 1/8 of an inch or so, maybe like 3 millimeters, 2 or 3 millimeters off the end that goes around the back. And then once you've got it trimmed, cut a little wedge. Sorry guys, that was my producer putting his fat fingers in frame, and I was going to cut that, but when I went and reviewed the footage, it didn't show up, so I thought I'd gotten away with not having that little interruption. I'm gonna have to give him some demerits, flog him a little bit. Anyway, back to the build. So once you've trimmed like 2 or 3 millimeters off the end that wraps around the back of the nacelle, if you cut a really shallow wedge off the part of the decal that's going to run up against the fin there that runs on the outside of the nacelle, it really helps with the placement and the fit of the nacelle, or of the decal. So that's just a little tip. We're not going to call them pro tips. After this build, I really don't feel like a pro. Like, I didn't really feel like a pro going into the formation of the channel or anything like that. I would definitely call myself, maybe a low intermediate skilled model builder. But I feel even further from a pro after this experience. So we're just going to call this a friendly tip. That it's okay to like trim and shape your decals according to the shape of the object you're going to be placing them on. And that might even make your job a little easier. with these thin decals, the one thing to be conscientious of is if you're gonna do it the way I do it with your fingers, it's gonna want to stick to your fingers. That's the only thing really to worry about here. And if you pull real straight like I didn't do, you can usually get it into place right off the bat. You don't have to worry about finagling it too much, but I didn't pull it completely straight, so I gotta finesse it back down to where it actually belongs. Now, because of the shape of the nacelle itself, when these decals wrap around, they have a tendency to wrap upwards around the back instead of wrapping, lateral at a 90-degree angle and just going straight from the angle that they were. But you can see how much extra hangs off there, and if you got it to work and you got it to wrap around without like trying to deform its way upwards, you'd have a lot of overhang, or a lot of overlap, I should say, between the two decals that go along the warp chiller grills. And again, if you can get it to lay down straight, I don't think that's necessarily an issue, but I haven't had much luck getting those to lay down terribly straight. All right, so here's the finished product with all the decals on it. We're going to do a gloss coat to seal everything, make sure our decals don't ever accidentally peel off or whatever. And then we'll let that sit and dry. And then we're going to put a dull coat over that. And the dull coat, of course, is to dull down the shininess of the finish and make our model look less like a toy and more like something that we might expect to see if the Enterprise B existed in real life. With this one, the decals were so shiny, I ended up actually doing two dull coats. If you find that to be the case that you need to, that's fine. So let's jump into notes. There are plenty. Surprise, here is this current build on the left versus the first build I ever did on the right. This is the current build. This is the one I did 10 years ago. You can see there's a little seam issue going on there. So what did we learn? Well, first of all, there are going to be fitment issues galore. I don't know if that's the age of the kit itself or if it's because of how I did the subassembly build, but I had a lot of fitment issues. Building in the subassembly process was maybe not the best idea because unfortunately it just led to me getting out in the weeds and making life more difficult than I needed it to be. So I don't know that I would necessarily recommend that route for this particular build. I think what I would do instead is stick to how I built the smaller ones, because then you're not going to have to worry so much about alignment issues. Like, you can see that I have some serious alignment issues between the saucer and the nacelle pylons, and that's because I didn't have the snap together parts to kind of guide my alignment. The other thing I would say is, as with previous builds, the decals are not necessarily sized terribly well. So just keep that in mind as you're doing the build, that you might need to trim a few of the decals in order to make them fit properly. And then the final thing I would say is the grid lines. If you feel like doing it, it's not necessary. It's just one of those personal things that I tend not to like. Other than that, I would say this is maybe not a beginner kit. It's more of an intermediate kit, but it's still a fun build. I had a lot of fun with it despite some of the frustrations, and I do highly recommend building it. But that is definitely going to do it for this episode. Come back in about a week. I'm gonna try to get back on schedule by getting another one out within the week. We're gonna start on the Enterprise C, and I've got some fun surprises in store for that one as well. So until then, have a blessed day and happy modeling.